Good morning. Our chapel speaker today, Devin Singh, is joining us for a few days this week as part of the chapel program review committee. Devin is a social theorist and scholar of religion and theology. He's an assistant professor of religion at Dartmouth College. Previously, he was a Mellon postdoc fellow in the humanities and a lecturer in religious studies at Yale University. He received his PhD from Yale, where he was given Yale's highest recognition for research in the humanities. Singh was also trained in social scientific theory and methods at the University of Chicago, theology and divinity at Trinity International University, and religious studies at Pomona College. On a more personal note, Devin is a dear friend of mine from graduate school, and I can vouch not only for his academic credentials, but also for his care as a friend, for his killer karaoke skills, and his dedication as a teacher. Please welcome Professor Singh to SBS.
Rage, rage, rage. Goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son, Achilles. Murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses. Hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls. Great fighter souls, but made their bodies carrion. Feasts for the dogs and birds. And the will of Zeus was moving toward its end. Begin, muse, when the two first broke and clashed, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. So begins one of the earliest founding texts in our so-called Western canon of literature. Homer's The Iliad, that great epic poem that has shaped our understandings of literature, poetry, philosophy, and history, is also a text about the structure of Western societies and about the forces that drive us together and tear us apart. And what does it begin with? What theme defines it and courses throughout its stanzas? Rage, fury, anger. This epic poem is about many things, but one of its central concerns is anger and its effects. It issues the warning that rage, if left unresolved, festering and improperly channeled, can be our personal undoing. It may also be the tipping point to unmake families, communities, and nations. How do you handle anger? How do you feel about your anger? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you fear it? Maybe you've never really even thought about it. One of my earliest memories of anger was as a toddler. My mother, father, and I were walking on the streets of DC, and they got into some argument on the sidewalk about who knows what. They were standing in front of a construction site, shouting back and forth. My mother, overcome with blinding rage at something my father had said or done, reached for a brick from a stack beside her, threatening to hurl it at him through her tears, sobs, and screams. Just then, a construction worker nearby called out to her gently, pleading, "Ma'am, think about your son." In shame and shock, she dropped the brick, and the three of us left and carried on home. Now, I don't actually remember this incident. I was too young. It occurred before I could talk. But it was narrated to me years later by my mom, in sadness and regret at the ways her actions may have impacted me. And even though I don't consciously remember it, it's lodged in my brain as a memory, for I was there, and I observed it and took it in as an impression on my young mind. This is one of many tales from my own family lore about the destructive forces of anger. I saw it displayed time and again among parents, siblings, uncles, and cousins. Family gatherings were usually joyous occasions, and yet were so easily punctuated and punctured by the razor's edge of fury. Most of my family members had never been equipped to deal with it well. How was anger modeled in your family? How did you see it resolved? What lessons have you learned about its power? Count your blessings if you saw anger handled well and constructively, with calm resolve and with reconciliation in mind. But if you're with the majority of us, you saw it manifested in yelling, cursing, slammed doors, or even beatings, or in smoldering silences, icy glares, passive aggression, and neglect. While, of course, we experience anger very personally and know it mainly in our family lives and personal relationships, anger and fury affect communities too. In the Iliad, anger was what drove two nations to war. A sense of pride and personal insult led to mass violence and bloodshed. Spending time in Africa as a child, I witnessed this firsthand as well. I lived for a number of years in Cameroon, during a time when nations around us were spiraling out of control in civil war, as warring tribes hacked each other to death with machetes. Some of this instability spilled over into my backyard, literally. Some other time I'll have to tell you about how my backyard was once bombed and how I, as a 6-year-old, was thrown across my bedroom floor from the blast, as shattered glass from the windows rained down around me. Geopolitical fury was made very real to me that day. Now, these conflicts are extremely complex, and I in no way mean to reduce them to the problem of anger alone. But rage and its spiraling damage were certainly part of the mix. Such bloodshed was partly due to a legitimate outrage at European colonial intervention in Africa over the centuries, as people were enslaved, resources were stolen, and different groups were set against each other through a colonial strategy of divide and conquer. This valid anger at colonial injustice was turned inward, eating away at and destroying families and communities, breaking out like a wildfire, as festering fury turned to self-destruction, and civil war was one result. Growing up without much instruction in what to do with anger and having seen its negative effects has led me over the years to try to get a better handle on what it is and what I can do about it. And in this brief time together, I won't pretend to offer you all the solutions or insights, but I do want to provide a few suggestions for further thought. Anger is a reaction to injustice, a response to the sense that something is not right in the world and that our boundaries, whether personal or communal, have been violated. With anger, we've been given a great power, and together with our rational minds, we've been given a great possibility. For anger is fuel. Anger is energy. Anger is the spark for change. Anger is there to help us set those violated boundaries right. But we've rarely been trained in how to handle it or what to do with its force when it wells up like a tidal wave inside us. Christian scripture proclaims, famously, "In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger." Now, a few insights can be gleaned here. First, at least for this author, anger itself is not a sin. The sin comes in the possible responses to anger, how it is used or misused. That's good news. It means we need not fear or be ashamed of anger on its own. It's how we then respond or react that matters. And that's the lesson from the second part of the phrase. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. In other words, do something with it. Don't let it sit, fester, and boil over. Anger is to be acted upon in constructive ways, and those actions are for change and resolution. More often than not, anger is the energy that fuels a conversation that needs to happen. At least in our personal lives, anger often emerges when we've experienced wrongdoing. And usually, the required response is a discussion that seeks to make the wrong right. Sometimes the change is in our minds, as misunderstandings are clarified and we realize no injustice was done. At other times, the change is interpersonal and requires apology, forgiveness, and reconciliation, as well as changes in behavior and attitude that come with them. Still other times, the change is communal, institutional, and structural, as embedded patterns of action and attitude are challenged for the ways they violate the dignity of certain people and communities. At a very practical level, anger first calls for pause and reflection. In your anger, stop. Breathe deeply. Reflect. Choose a course of action that brings restoration and healing. I know this sounds easier than done, easier said than done, but it's a habit to be built up over time, like a muscle trained and strengthened. You're at a critical time in your lives now when you're learning the skills and habits that can lead you to flourish long term. Things like stress and anger management are central to that success. Sadly, we're all well aware of the recent example in Florida of grief turning to anger and boiling over into rage and violence in the recent school shooting. This is a clear and obvious example of where anger must not lead. And yet, we've also seen one positive way grief and reasonable anger can be channeled as surviving students have mobilized to see laws and attitudes changed in our country to try to reduce these tragedies, let them be an example of positive action based on understandable rage and pain. We've all heard about Achilles' heel. We know the legend that he was blessed with strength and power, save one spot behind his ankle where he was vulnerable to harm. And yet the real lesson of Achilles in the Iliad is not about his magical enchantment and mythic power. The lesson of Achilles is that his anger and fury were his undoing. His seething rage was his Achilles' heel, and he brought down many with him. With anger, we all as well have been given great power. But let's not follow the example of Achilles, who was actually no hero, but a tragic figure. Begin your training now to shore up potential vulnerable points, like a quick temper or a tendency to withdraw and sulk, for instance. Rather than letting anger consume you, let it give you the strength to constructively make things right in your own lives and in the world. Thank you.